Okay. Again, since there's some new faces, which is always nice, so let me explain a little bit about the history of this and thank some people, and then make a few comments regarding our last topics, and then also explain some new changes. Okay. Again, this is we hold these gatherings by due to the generosity of David Silver, whose loft this is, and who is our tech person, and who has kept a really wonderful archives of all of the lectures that we've done. At some point, they'll actually be available for consumers. They sort of are available now. It's just a question of filling orders is a little less than efficient. But at any rate, so David, thanks to David, we've been able to do this. And I have decided, after discussing with a number of participants and just also my own thoughts, and with Dr. Schiff, who was actually not going to be on the phone today. He had to be out of town up in Seattle. That actually I'm going to change the pattern. It's after 15 some odd years of doing this, I've really begun to, I guess the choice of death was a Freudian projection of some sort, or a statement to end on. That I'm going to change the format for these, and really, since largely the group consists of people who come fairly regularly and who have some background in orgonomic literature and practice, that I'm going to try to set up a situation where we come together a couple of times each season, fall, winter, winter, spring, and where I will choose, again, a topic, but specifically following, I've decided, the development of Reich's work, starting from character analysis through the last work, and key it to specific readings. Not a lot of readings. It's not going to be an academic course, but with specific designated readings that we can come and talk and interact around on specific topics, so that it won't be he said, she said, I remember Dr. Reich said this. And then once or twice a year I will hold a general lecture presenting an introduction to orgonomy for the general public. Although these, as I projected, these seminars around the readings will be open to anybody, even newcomers. So I'll keep you posted. If you're not on, all of you are pretty much on my mailing list. If you're not, or if you move around, give me a mailing address at the end. Okay. That said, let me just sort of pick up as a way of transitioning into today's topic. On the last presentation, in which there was some misunderstandings possibly about what I and Dr. Schiff were trying to present, and I take full responsibility for what I consider, in retrospect, somewhat sloppy presentation, which I apologize for. And that is that if anyone got the idea that what I was saying, or what Dr. Schiff was saying, was that the orgasm function was not central, or not, the core of orgonomic practice and orgonomic science, then that was my error and in the presentation. Okay, it was my intention to try to focus on the fact that there has tended to be, as in all aspects of the broader mass psychology or social organization, a mystification of that function, and I was emphasizing extensively the problems of that kind of mystification and what it does both to people who are interested in the work, as well as people who are in treatment, and people who pick up on Reich's work and begin to conceive of the big O, which is different than the function of the orgasm. The big orgasm, the sort of mystical experience that will, bring you beyond, all your misery and suffering, was really what I was addressing. So just to be very, very clear that the orgasm function is the central core mechanism in the biological organism, and without that, regulating effectively, or when that becomes blocked, the results are a variety of pathological developments, or what Reich designates as biopathies, which we will talk about today, because that's central to the issue of the concept of, or looking at the phenomena of death and dying, okay, from an orgonomic perspective. So are there any, in regards to what, and the last statement is to say that there was a controversy around my reference to the discussion both in the function of the orgasm and in the sexual revolution on the issue of whether Reich, there was also, I think, a misunderstanding of what I was saying, and the implication was that Reich felt that that having sex should be as casual as having a glass of water when you're thirsty. That is not what Reich says in the sexual revolution or the function of the orgasm. Okay? What he does say is that the trivializing of it with that kind of accusation presents a great deal of misunderstandings about human sexuality and sexual function. The statement of the fact that when you're very, very thirsty, having a glass of water has the same kind of relief and gratification as being in need of a love contact was my addition to that statement. What I was trying to say was that there was a common functioning principle between taking care of a basic tension at any point, but the misunderstanding was that I was in no way saying that this was equivalent to having a full embrace, a full sexual release, or a full sexual function. So I want to make that clear, okay? So if there are any remaining issues around this or questions around this, we can bring them up now before we move on. Or if I have, I'll hold your peace.
Dehydration,
right.
Can lead to something very serious.
Right.
And the same thing with lack of sex.
Right.
So that I didn't think it was so trivial.
No, it wasn't. What I meant was I didn't want to interpret that either Reich was saying that it was that it was the same as a sexual embrace, and what I was trying to say was that there was for a couple of you who weren't here, this might not be very important, but since it was an issue, just trying to that while there was a common functioning principle in all issues of being deprived of gratification, that I want to reemphasize that the core of orgonomic science, orgonomic practice, and understanding is the function of the orgasm, or specifically the nature of pulsation, of tension, charge, and discharge. And by all means, the fuller the embrace, the more genuine the sexual biological embrace, the more functional and the more alive and healthier the organism will be, provided it happens in a context, in a society, which is also part of what I was trying to say, that can support that, which it often doesn't occur in. But again, I just wanted to clear that up, okay? And part of that did lead to my feeling that changing the format and going back to a basic reading, a sort of a core reading of Reich's works would be useful for myself as well as anyone else who's really interested in this. So I guess we'll have like the equivalent of a Bible study.
If I can make one comment about the character analysis. I got a letter in the mail yesterday from the College of Orgonomic in Princeton. And the letters now sound like these sales letters that I occasionally receive from vitamin companies.
I think this is it.
But what they're saying really sort of threw me for a loop, even though I've learned to expect it from them. They said that a lot of people enjoy reading character analysis because they get an idea of how they too will improve and have such a wonderful life. So they're selling snake oil now. That's really what
Well, they've been doing.
When I made character analysis, I got depressed. I didn't get that feeling at all.
Yeah, well, I don't know that it's. I mean, I think again, there are other people here who don't know the ins and outs of various groups that have followed Reich's work, but just to be said that there's been a tendency again to basically present Reich, even by the groups who tend to be involved with Reich, as a panacea, as a cure-all, and part of what the American College of Orgonomy, which is the largest faction around Reich's work, is doing is trying to say that we have the same answers and better answers than any other group, and so come to us and we'll give you health and happiness. Which Reich, the sad thing, and I guess maybe that's a good segue into this material. The saddest thing about the misrepresentations of Reich, at least as I see them, is that Reich was always meticulous to point out that his work offered no miracle cures, no special, vaccinations against misery, no special conditions of preventing you from having to struggle. In keeping with that, one of the wonderful recollections I have of Dr. Sobey was complaining to him at one point, I had solved some big problem in my life, but then there was another problem, and I was complaining that I had another problem to deal with. He said, that's health. I said, what the heck? I thought that you solved one problem. Once you were able to solve a problem, you were finished. And he said, no, when the healthier the organism is, it's freer to go on and move on to the next problem. The unhealthy organism gets stuck and only can deal with one problem and is constantly reliving that problem. We're never moving from that problem. So that motility and activity is the goal. And it's not as a matter of fact, I think as Reich clearly says in numerous writings, that the healthier and more mobile and more engaged the organism is, the more risks it takes. One of the big arguments, among what Dr. Rothenberg used to call the Orgonomaniacs was when Reich died of heart disease and possible other complications. There was a feeling some people reacted this way to Dr. Sobey's dying of lymphoma, was that, see, there was something wrong with Orgon. Why wasn't he? And in fact, the point being is the more open the organism, the more alive the organism, the more risk the organism takes and the more chance there is for potential damage to the organism. It doesn't give you, it isn't the holy grail that gives you the guaranteed long life. It gives you, however, the years that you spend will be, packed with more, knowledge, more experience, more pleasure, if it's possible. So I think this is a crucial understanding. And that was largely, for me, the theme that I had wished to explore, was going back to the famous, Reich joke A.S. Neal picked up on, and which turns out, as I think I said before, to be a Sufi, a tale of the devil, the little devil coming to the big devil to say that they discovered the truth on earth, and Satan says, well, that's no problem, we'll just send someone up to organize it. So I think what I was trying to get over, I think important to understand, is that when there is basic insight and understanding, the nature of social pathology is such as that there are always people who can begin to sell it as snake oil, or can begin to misrepresent it or package it in ways that undermine the basic insights and understanding. And that's why the last thing that I have from Dr. Sobey was that Reich said to him and Dr. Handelman, don't set up any big organizations, just do the work and try to stay as clear about it as you can. And I think that's, if I have a message or something I want to pass on, would be and that's why I think coming back to reading rather than saying Reich said this, Reich said that, but actually looking at the work, I think would be useful. The big question about going back to the readings, as always from seminars that we've run, is whether you can get past page 1. usually what happens is you start reading page 1 and there's so much to discuss that it takes 2 hours, based on 1 or 2 paragraphs. Anyway, that said, what I'd like to start out with, because in a sense to discuss the issue of dying, or the death process, or the process of death, or the function of death in nature, I think, again, it sort of as a response to the last meeting, I want to be clear that we understand the function of the orgasm. I'm not going to give a long lecture on the function of the orgasm, but I want to really place that central to this discussion, because there's no way to look at the issue of deterioration or dying in the organism without understanding what the function of the orgasm is. And since there are some newer people here who might not know this material, I think it's worth reviewing, or at least summarizing what Reich's understanding and not so much a discovery. Reich always insisted this was not a discovery as much as an elucidation and an articulation of a basic function that was available, or as Dr. Sobey always used to love to say, was something that every deer in the woods understood, or every little animal in nature understood by its nature. And in a sense, it goes back to Reich's ideas about elucidating and expanding on our roots in nature, our root in nature. So the function of the orgasm, again, remains core to living function and the expression of life. Okay, and again, the fundamental principle really was not even specifically articulated, or Reich did not articulate it for the first time. What he did was to elaborate it, expand it, and understand it on a level that had not previously been available, certainly in the Western literature. Okay? It was actually Freud that began to understand the mechanical function of the orgasm based on the 19th century work of a number of neurologists and physiologists who were studying reproductive cycle, and particularly male arousal. Okay? But Freud was smart enough to understand that the process of excitation, tumescence, meaning basically peak of excitation, and detumescence, meaning the discharge mechanically of the penis, was in some way a basic biological function of the organism. And Freud went further as to say that in this process the organism experienced a peak flow of pleasure, a peak experience of pleasure. And this was essentially the principle that Freud used and designated as the central principle or idea behind his concept of the pleasure principle, or pleasure-unpleasure principle. However, Freud left that principle as in a sense, almost a philosophical or metaphysical or metapsychological center of his work, and didn't really look at it in terms of its practical biological roots and its practical biological significance. When Reich began to explore that, what he was specifically interested in was this function actually regulating some real biological energy in the organism. The interesting thing to remember about Reich was that the total line of Reich's research, he says this in Reich Speaks of Freud, started as early as his 18th, 19th year, maybe even back on the farm when he was a kid, was really the study of energy and the nature of biological energy and its function in the organism. He was always fascinated about how animals had sex, what sex functioned, not just the act of sex, but what it did for animals. And he talks about studying and watching and being fascinated with it, as well as personally excited by the idea of it from a very early age. So what Freud put out as a general principle, Reich begins to explore scientifically and in the laboratory and in natural research out in the clinics and among his students. And specifically trying to see if this pleasure principle, or this function of excitation and charge and discharge, could actually be regulating a specific energy. And at that point, the assumption was if there was an energy that it was specifically regulating in the organism, this would be what Freud had called the libido, the libidinal energy. Freud saw that libidinal energy, again, pretty much based on his own speculations with no scientific investigation, as a finite, meaning a very limited quantity of energy that each organism was given at birth, so that you were born with this charge. So in the actual German, it's referred to as the soul. The soul. Soul. The soul.
Soul,
spirit.
S-O-U-L.
Yeah. So, but in German, it means a little more like the spirit or the spark of life. Okay, and Freud sort of left it there. Reich actually, and Freud made a comment that eventually students would study this and see if they could really demonstrate the actual physical nature of this energy or of this, libidinal energy. Whether Freud actually thought anyone was going to do it or not remains to be seen. He certainly got uncomfortable when, in fact, Reich took him very seriously and actually began to investigate the nature of that energy. And eventually, as for those of you who know Reich's work or know this material, actually isolated that energy, demonstrated that energy, and in the process demonstrated how it was regulated in the organism. And out of that, he linked up the actual, or established the actual energetic core of what Freud had called the pleasure principle, this issue of charge, peak, discharge, and relaxation, and realized that this was the function, that this expressed itself most efficiently and most clearly in the organism as the orgasm function. And it was out of that that he presented no longer the pleasure principle, but the fuller expansion of that into the function of the orgasm, the exploration of the nature of orgasm in the biological organism and its function. And there, as always with Reich, is the crucial step. He wasn't interested in just describing the mechanical function of the orgasm, right? He was interested in what its fundamental purpose was, or how it organized and maintained living function in humans as well as all organisms in nature. And he, as I've often pointed out, spent a great deal of time looking specifically also at single cells, at one-celled organisms, okay? At particular organisms that to see if this function was universal. And one of the fundamental, if we could call it a discovery, I guess would be the closest thing to a discovery, was to demonstrate that this function of the orgasm was present in all living matter, but not always in exactly the same presentation, so that the function of the orgasm was demonstrable and identifiable in a single-celled amoeba, as well as a complex, a multicellular complex organism like the human organism. And it expressed itself in specific individual ways depending on the particular organism, but the fundamental functioning principle remained the same. And that principle, again, as always worth remembering, is that we go from that all living matter goes from a state of relaxation or ease to a state of charge or tension to a state of acme or peak, okay? And at that point, assuming there's no interference, we'll discharge fully, right? And experience both the sensation of discharge, and we'll also experience then coming back to a state of ease or relaxation, what I call the but more than in the sense of, boy, that feels good, a real sense of the whole organism's truly letting go, in a sense, emptying out, and then, achieving a state of relative ease and tranquility and peace, how you could describe it. At that point, even Reich says it becomes the subject of art, and artists and poets talking, or musicians talking, or describing in some way what it feels like to experience that. But on a biological level, it's simply the organism is at ease. Okay? Now, again, just in quick summary, what Reich also points out, once he has that real common functioning principle to all living matter, is what happens when that functioning principle is interfered with. When that common functioning principle is interfered with, variety of disturbances can result. If it is temporary or transitory or variable, it can be nothing more than irritation, annoyance, nothing that can't be reversed. If it becomes long-term and chronic, meaning that the interference with this natural function becomes persistent, right? The organism will do what any organism must do, which is to build up defenses against this, to try to minimize or to avoid in some way the extremely uncomfortable or even detrimental or threatening or dangerous effects of this interference. That will become what Reich realizes as the mechanism that produces, right, defensive procedures in the body of the cell or the organism, as well as in the behavior of the organism, that if it persists, will become chronic. If it becomes chronic enough, will become permanent, or largely permanent, or relatively fixed, at which point you begin to see what Reich came to call the armored organism. Okay. So in a nutshell, that is the basic, not so much discovery, but the basic insight and the basic articulation of this process of living matter and the engagement of living matter in the environment. Now, in Reich's work, can be divided into various periods. What I've just described, I would call the first major period of discovery in Reich's work. And out of that comes essentially the centerpiece, which is the function of the orgasm. And certainly in his clinical work, both in terms of treating behavioral disorders or emotional disorders, that becomes central. As he moved deeper and deeper into the study of biology and away from clinical practice, which he did do, and particularly as he got towards the latter part of his career, roughly the end of the period in Scandinavia just before he came to the United States, the last 10 or 15 years of his career, he began to move deeper and deeper into biology or biological or cosmic biological functioning, both the nature of the biological organism, not just the human organism, of biology, as well as biology's location in the larger extent of nature and the cosmos. Often misleading people who read Reich to think that he became more and more mystical. In fact, if one reads Ether, God, and Devil, or Cosmic Superimposition, it's not mystical at all. What he's trying to do is to place the living organism, or not only in nature, but to see what nature, how nature is an expression of the broader function of the universe, not some God. Although the concept of God becomes illuminated in the sense that one begins to understand why most armored organisms can only relate to that experience as a mystical, religious, godlike figure. And interestingly, unlike many of Reich's students, Reich, as I went back and was rereading, Reich is not very negative about that. Reich says that's a very natural and reasonable, extension. So to begin to think of God, or begin to think in somewhat cosmic, even somewhat spiritual sense, is not unreasonable and not in and of itself pathology, but that it is the result of the limitation of the organism. Okay, that the concept of God can become too easily, again, organized as truth, as a simple solution to one's problems, and that it's harder to stay with just looking at this as a natural function, which is certainly what he presents.
Also, people will tend to place in
Right.
this deity all of their masturbation guilt, and then there's this figure watching them and knowing everything every time that they touch themselves.
Yeah, well, more than just masturbation guilt, what happens is this figure becomes the sole depository of all their greatest wishes and fantasies, as well as their fears and hatreds, and it becomes sort of the ultimate Rorschach. I mean, you can project anything and everything. It is the source of all pleasure and all pain, and all goodness and all misery. And again, it's a place to basically escape, as Reich would say, your responsibility for being you. For just simply being. Living your life in the moment. As far as we know, the deer in the woods or the rabbit or the mole doesn't pray to a god to figure out why they can't dig through this particular piece of earth. They try to figure. Reich has the most wonderful image about the difference between a rational organism and an organism that's already armored. If you remember those tapes that we listened to of Reich talking, when a healthy organism is walking and comes across a big stone that's blocking its way, right? What does it do? It walks around it or steps over it, does something that makes sense to get out of it. Whereas the unhealthy organism does what? Starts kicking the stone, spends all of its time trying to move the stone when a simple 2 steps to the left and 1 step forward resolves the problem. So that often the creation of elaborate systems, of elaborate concepts, elaborate ideologies, and it doesn't have to be religion. It can be communism. It can be certainly Reich, which often makes most of us who come from a variety of liberal, backgrounds, uncomfortable. That Reich really saw that in communism, certainly in the communism as it became expressed internationally, was essentially another form of mystification or stagnation of the organism's response socially to this fundamental principle of trying to become freer. He also makes very clear, which I think is vitally important in our society today, that at the core, as a result of this, the longing for freedom, the longing for natural function remains central to all of us, so that we're all very, very easily and willingly drawn towards liberation movements, drawn towards movements that offer, higher levels of pleasure, higher levels of functioning. But often those movements can't really free the organism, and so they become, in a sense, ways of distracting from the natural function rather than intensifying it. In fact, no movement, and that was part of what I was trying to do in the last lecture, no movement, including orgonomy, can free the organism to that just simply by joining the movement or by accepting the dogma or accepting the principles. It requires essentially the freeing of the organism as much as possible, therefore the result of clinical work to the extent that it can happen. Although certainly for Reich, the hope was that by working and raising healthier children, that this would become increasingly less of a problem, and that these organisms would be more open and free.
I always thought about that. When you're young and you're drawn to orgonomy,
right,
and other people are drawn to other places. Mm-hmm. I always sort of look around at the people that are drawn to orgonomy and say, what brings us here? There is a difference in terms of like why you're drawn here.
I guess so. I mean, it would be for each of you, not me or any of us, to presume to say that. I think we all bring it for a reason. Obviously, and I think Reich, I think you're raising a very good point. Reich really, I think, said that basically most people are searching for some understanding, and I think, in my view, part of this whole thing of death is part of it is also to try to understand what the hell this is all about, and how we wind up dealing with this central issue is that all of this, everything that we're doing here, right, today, is all of a sudden going to...
transitory.
It's going to go out on some level for each of us individually, certainly. And yet there's something vital about it, and it's so... the wonderful thing about being alive is that it's so alive. And I think that the attraction of Reich, but I think Reich himself said many other movements, many other ideas, whether it's poetry, there are people who are drawn to poetry readings, poetry groups, art groups, theater. I think in many ways there's the same central functioning principle, which is a searching for or an attempt to find a connection to this vital pulsation, this vital expression of life. Why orgonomy, and why those of us who were, if I had to look at common things that I've known over the years, both working with patients and people I know, that almost everybody I know was in some way, or is in some way, someone who is, I would call a searcher, someone who, where the spark hasn't been completely deadened to the point where they can't, look and answer. But the danger of this is always to get into the idea that somehow, we talked about this last week, that this makes it special, or us special as opposed to others. And I think that's something one has to, really watch out for, because it can become...
But so much of his knowledge came from those workshops, like in People in Trouble, when these millions of people would start coming and they had those questions, and they all had to do with sex, they all had to do with that thing that no one was talking about. So he always got to the really human thing of...
That's why everybody, in the same sense, why those who knew Dr. Sobey would talk about Dr. Sobey and a number of the orgonomists, but Dr. Sobey being unique, which was that when you talk to him about, I try to think what Dr. Sobey would say in this kind of lecture. He would say, just do it, it would not be a, an elaborate, he would say to me, you talk too much, stop talking, just get on with it, Okay, so and on that note...
So just do it, die.
Die. We'll dive right into death, okay? Anyway, so once you have that principle, though, it seems to me, from an orgonomic perspective, to talk about the issue of death is really was a tagline for me, because in fact, looking back over Reich's work, I could find no very extensive discussions of death. I looked in the index, I went through books. There are places where he talks about what the dying process is. But more specifically, he really talks about the nature of the limitation of the organism and the reduction in the natural function of the living. Meaning, what happens when this function of the orgasm, this self-regulatory process, begins to become interfered with in a variety of ways. And so that what I wound up realizing is that the place where the greatest insight into Reich's ideas or insights into the nature of death or the function of death were really in the cancer biopathy and in the study of cancer processes, right? And making this point about the fact that there were two stages and two broad areas of Reich's research and work. In the latter part of Reich's research, I got to be very careful when I say this, because someone's going to say, that I'm trying to get rid of the orgasm function. In the latter part of Reich's research, he began to talk less and less about the function of the orgasm as the sole source of, rather the dysfunction of the orgasm as the sole source of pathology, and more interested in the process of shrinking, or the organism becoming more and more and less and less motile, less and less active, less and less pulsatory. And that in the latter research, he became more and more interested in the processes of pulsation and the interferences with pulsation. And in fact, the research into cancer, which was originally looked at as a single kind of disease function, in the end, Reich began to realize that what you were really looking at is a variety of diseases, a variety of illnesses that were the result of a broader problem, which was what he called the carcinoma shrinking biopathy. Or
resignation.
Well, that too, but that's more we'll hold the issue of resignation, I think, is crucial, and that's certainly crucial in relationship to the process of dying and death. But more specifically, what Reich began to see was that he had made a fundamental error in the cancer research in assuming that cancer was an actual specific disease function, rather than, and this is fascinating because in the contemporary, even central medical literature now, the realization is that there is no one phenomena called cancer, that what is broadly called cancer is a variety of various illnesses that affect cellular function, cellular reproduction, and can operate in a variety of specific ways once the specific cancer is present. But more specifically, Reich began to look for what was commonly present in all forms of cancer, and what that led him to was an understanding that in all forms of pathology, basically breakdown of the organism, there was a common functioning principle, and that principle was the fact that the cells on the basic cellular level began to shrink. And he became more and more interested in what this process of shrinking was, right? And it seems to me that to understand orgonomically, or at least as I come to understand death or dying, is that this is the final result of the organism shrinking, literally, from basically becoming more and more limited in its motility. So that in the simplest terms, again, to use our friend the amoeba, which Reich always liked to come back to, if you have, when you study amoebas and look at them under a microscope, a nice, plump, healthy amoeba that's dividing and living in a very vibrant environment, you can see literally pulsing, moving actively. As the environment becomes more restricted, or as the circumstances of the amoeba's life functions become more limited, it becomes less modal, meaning it moves less, it becomes less plump and vibrant. The pulsation, literally, you can see, becomes more and more tentative, more and more erratic, right? And then gradually it begins to move less in its environment. And then when death actually, or when it actually dies, what simply happens is it collapses. And it looks like a dead amoeba, if you looked at it under a microscope, looks like essentially a grain of sand, like an inorganic, little, drop of sand. So that in a sense, to me, represents probably the paradigm or the model for what life and death is, and that you can then begin to build out from that. Now, it's certainly much more complicated when we look at the human organism, because to begin with, and here I think the cancer biopathy becomes vital in that way. To begin with, the human organism, or certainly larger, more complex animal organisms, right, are multicellular. So one of the first things that becomes clear is that obviously there are circumstances in which a lightning bolt hits you, or a brick falls on your head, you can be, out and dead immediately in that sense. But the issue there is, the fascinating thing is whether when you get hit on the head and go unconscious, right, and are in effect dead by all legal standards. And this is the one interesting thing is, if you follow legal forensic issues, has a lot to do with when someone is dead. Contrary to what everybody has always assumed, there's huge arguments about what death and when death takes place, and when an organism is actually dead. For most of us, what we assume death is, on a personal level, is when we stop consciously operating, and when the screen goes blank. Again, we each have probably our own fantasies or ideas about it, none of which are any better than anyone else's. But in fact, the actual issue of dying is much, much more complex than that, even in the standard medical literature, as to what really constitutes dying. That even after consciousness, ceases, the organism is not, in principle, necessarily dead. It takes a while for the organism to break down, and for the cells, the multicellular functions, to completely cease and desist. And even when organ function stops, cellular function doesn't. It takes a while, and even
when breathing is stopped, does that have any?
Not necessarily. Again, certainly when breathing stops, and there's no longer oxygen in the system, the organism begins to, it is no longer functional. On a cellular level, though, there's still many aspects of the cellular function that continue to be alive. Cells don't die. It takes a while for all the cells in the organism to break down and die. And that's just on the mechanical function. Okay? But once we come to it orgonomically, the issue is, it seems to me a very central issue, is what is the nature of energy in the organism? In Freud's old model, which was that you got this, the way Freud explained death was you got this finite amount of energy that was given to you here, boom, you're alive, right? And that every time you went to the bathroom, every time you took a pee, every time you made love, every time you read a book, you discharged some of that energy that was given to you. Every time you made love, some of that energy. Every time you masturbated, that's why even in Freud, you weren't supposed to masturbate that much, because every time you masturbated, you were losing some of that finite energy. So you had to keep it if you wanted to stay healthy. In Freud's terms, death was literally like an hourglass, a running out of that finite amount of energy. And then finally, and I've always tried to figure, when I was younger, how do you get that much energy? How much energy is it? Is it a big bunch of energy? I mean, it was a little bit. I never could understand conceptually what that was about. What Reich offered was the fact that, in fact, it wasn't finite. It was metabolic. It was, in other words, it moved in and out of the organism like breathing, like any kind of energetic function. It was metabolized. It came in, it went out. It was replenishable, depending on the health of the ability of your organism to continue that process. Now, on a cellular level, every cell that is alive is capable of essentially absorbing energy, orgone energy from the atmosphere, and then and releasing it. So, at what point that process stops in the living organism is a really interesting question. I don't have an exact answer, neither did Reich. The latter part of Reich's research, which is where I think the issues of what dying is and death is, and what the process of death is in the living organism, begins to become available, is that in fact, this in the complex living organism takes place over a much, much more extended period of time than we realize. So we tend to think of dying and death as something that happens when we get really sick or we get really injured or hurt or limited. But that in fact is a process that's going on probably to some extent from the time we're born. So there's always a process of deterioration of some of the organism and then replenishing of other aspects of it. And that health, rather than functioning as an ideal state in which you're not sick and you're not dying, is literally that the organism is capable of essentially maintaining health, living function above a certain level of optimal, operation. Sickness is when that becomes more and more limited, and the process of dying is when your organism cannot effectively replenish, right, what is naturally lost and discharged, on a daily, minute by minute, continuous basis. What happens to organisms that become more and more severely limited, right? And this is where the cancer research, I think, is vital, is that parts of the body or areas of the body, and there from a clinical perspective is fascinating, and it's another area, as Dr. Rothenberg said, of where wonderful research could be done, in terms of looking at how disease function sets out. Now, Reich had hoped, one of his last projects that he had articulated, you want to set that guy? One of the last projects that Reich had articulated, I haven't found in the literature, Dr. Sobey told me about this, it might be on one of the tapes, lectures, was to eventually build an atlas of the human organism from a cellular level all the way up to the whole organization, so that you could identify where specific areas of blockage and dysfunction and dis-ease or disturbance were, and locate why or how that organism was not functioning in that area, and begin to treat those specific areas where disease began to, or biopathies began to present themselves. And he was literally conceived of this as a gigantic atlas that one could refer to and study. And of course that never happened.
Medicine now, they're doing the DNA thing and
Yeah.
saying
The
they
map
can
of the
predict.
genome.
Yeah.
Isn't it the same thing?
Well,
in a way?
That's
had-
more like
predicting-
Eastern.
Yeah, this is
It's
more,
not,
this
it's not
is,
connected with any.
no, I think these things are all connected, but what
they
happens,
They don't connect it.
no, they don't connect it, and I think also what happens is in Western medicine or in Western science, the tendency is to see this as a catalog of, like a list. This does this does this. And the big problem, if you study this, which I do, I look at this continuously, is the central problem in modern genetics and modern behavioral studies, and also in the study of morbidity and mortality, which is a big area in medicine too. The big problem is they can't find a common functioning principle. They can't figure out how this all operates and how a problem in the genetic, a flaw in the genetic structure here affects ultimate functioning in another area. They don't have a mechanism yet. And of course, their assumption is eventually they'll find some sort of chemical or some sort of mechanical connection between it all that will put it all into, simple order. I think what Reich offers is that the issue is not that it won't be available in terms of its simply mechanical function. It's fine. I often think that Reich probably would love all the information that they're getting today, but it would just be understanding more of the refined issues of how the mechanics of the organism works, but you still have to understand what the organism functions with and how the organism functions. And there, I think, Reich's concept of the orgasm function and the nature of pulsation in living matter becomes central. So that as living, in Reich's construction of this, as the organism or as the cell becomes more and more limited, disease or dysfunction presents itself, or dying presents itself. In the human organism, why Reich was very fascinated with cancer he began to develop a really profound insight into the fact that you had this amazing phenomena, which is you had this organism which, for all intents and purposes, certainly socially, was alive. And yet, when you actually looked at cancer, what was happening was that some area of the body on a cellular level was dead, was no longer pulsing, or that the pulsation was completely out of whack. The fascinating thing, which Reich talked about very specifically, was that when you actually looked at cancer cells, they were very, very different than that. What we talk about as that basic pulsatory function. Cancer cells don't pulse. They become rigid. They become almost solidified. And that a tumor, when you looked at a tumor, right, what was astounding about it was what Reich called that it was petrified. It wasn't dead. The fascinating thing wasn't that there was no energy in it. In fact, there was a lot of energy, but none of the energy was in the individual cells. The energy was in constant explosion of growth. But the growth was like a rock, which is what we call tumors. Okay, and that in one sense, at one point, Reich talks about the fact that these cells, in one sense, are almost immortal, and that they're not going to go through processes of, so that theoretically, if the organism were large enough, it could continue spreading and indefinitely. Of course, what happens to us as a living organism, we can't tolerate it, and eventually our organ functions break down. It closes off. Right. So that theoretically, now that becomes interesting, and always as with Reich, in terms of our roots in nature, the next step that he went to, of course, was to say, well, death is interesting, and the biological breakdown is interesting, but does it stop there? And then he began to realize that, wait a second, it's really a process that continues out beyond the specific individual living organism, and that you can actually, if you begin to look at this, in nature, in the environment, and then in the cosmos, that these are processes that continue in the whole of nature, that these processes of limitation, shrinking, breakdown, and so in a sense, death in the living individual organism is a particular expression of processes that exist throughout nature.
Like door or nominal?
Well, yeah, these are the concepts. These are the concepts that become known in orgonomy as deadly orgone energy and its functions, or the beginnings of what we would today call pollution, which Reich was the first person, even before Rachel Carson, to identify processes of watching the phenomena. For instance, he became very fascinated at watching the phenomena of the fact that you looked at trees, and against all biological, sense, you had trees that were dying from the top down. In other words, they were getting black. They were still alive, and yet they were beginning to just basically become, shrink and become less and less functional. And he was fascinated with that. And then he also began to notice that even rocks, which aren't alive in principle. Of course, one of the interesting things that Reich also has to offer, I think, in terms of his insights, is that the concept of living and non-living is a very, very, problematic concept. In that, the whole value of a lot of Reich's work is that when you begin, particularly in the Bion studies and the origins of life and how life comes alive, is the line between living matter and inorganic matter is very, very vague. And one of the problems that they're having today in the natural sciences, where they're trying to study the origins of life, is they can't really establish at what point it goes from being non-living to suddenly being living. And Reich was one of the first to also articulate the fact that the answer is that there isn't a fine line. There isn't a specific line. This is non-living and this is living. That there are things that take place, and that the central thing that takes place is energy. And it is the nature of energy, and is the function of energy in matter. And when energy becomes organized in particular ways, that's when it is what we would call living, as opposed to the same organisms, the same circumstances without that energy are non-living. And in one sense, in that insight, right, is also the other end, which is death. So what is it, therefore, when we die? When the
is there any material that doesn't have energy in it on this earth? Not
that we know of.
So, in other words, it's not a question of energy being lacking in one material, like in a rock, and being present.
Right. It's how that energy expresses itself.
But also the amount of charge.
Right. The amount of charge and how it expresses itself. The specifics is in a rock or in inorganic matter, right? The energy is present, but it doesn't express itself in a pulsatory.
It's in a frozen state, I think he would have said.
It's in a frozen state, and it's also moves through. It doesn't pulse. It basically when you build an orgone accumulator, for the inorganic, it essentially transmits and moves through. It doesn't pulse. In the organic, it's stored. It's not frozen. It's not locked. It's stored, and it pulses, and it can move, but it moves in a specific pulsatory manner. It has a different organization. And in the early Bion experiments, in the study of the early stages of the Bion experiments, what you see literally is what had appeared to be inorganic matter beginning to do something it didn't do before, which is begins to become motile. It begins to pulse.
It begins to be trapped inside a membrane.
Right.
And
it moves.
And
it begins to pulse. It becomes the amazing thing. If you can go up to Orgonon, and I think the presentation will be certainly adequate, where they're going to do the lab work and stuff. You'll get to see this. It's an astounding phenomenon. You suddenly. At Orgonon this summer, they're doing a presentation of all of these kinds of experiments and lab work. You'll get to see this amazing phenomenon where literally things that are essentially not living.
Sand bions.
Sand bions. I assume they're going to be doing that, or even the grass. The grass.
It's more about the Reich blood test. And understanding cancer.
But even in any of this work, what you see is things that are not living suddenly. If you look at particularly the sand, the Bion experiments with the granules, or even the vesicle experiments with the grass infusion, you take this stuff that's not living, And you watch it, and gradually it begins to move and organize and begins to become motile, and pulse. And that's an amazing thing. Now, is that creating life? Life is created. Who, how, what? That essentially, you don't need to see this as godlike. It simply is a way the energy, what Reich offers is the way the energy becomes organized. So that in a sense, death then becomes really a process of that, of a increased deterioration of that process. And as the organism becomes less and less capable of maintaining that integrity of pulsation and that integrity of charge and discharge, death begins to set in. And that what Reich's final formulation of this was not so much around the issue of cancer. What he described was one of the most fascinating ideas was that he described it as, again, he comes back to that central image of a flowing stream going into a beautiful crystal clear lake, okay? And the lake is completely alive. But if the stream gets blocked and the lake and the flow out of the lake gets blocked, the lake will become brackish, it'll become thick, it'll become stagnant. And for a while, it'll be very alive. Matter of fact, in some instances, it'll become even more alive. One of the fascinating things about cancer is there are periods when individuals, what we begin to understand now, are developing cancers when they begin to become more alive in some ways. They even seem at times for a while more energetic. There's these there's a huge charge, right? Then gradually, what Reich says is that lake, right, will begin to become thicker, less motile, less capable of. There's a lot of charge, but it becomes, heavier, slushier, swampier, and eventually it's going to become a swamp. It's going to become very, very thick, oozy. Parts of it are going to become really muddy, heavy, putrid. Sense of death, the smell of decay, right? Because the organism isn't going to be able to articulate. And then gradually, and this is consistent with nature studies, naturalists who study the nature of pollution and breakdown, sections of the lake will become not only swamp-like, will begin to become dead. And it'll become thick muck, basically, ooze, in which very, very little life or function can be maintained, and gradually it will become solidified, and if left to its own long enough, will become petrified. And you'll literally get the petrification of whole areas of lake. But while that goes on, parts of the lake might still remain relatively functional.
Because they're able to pulsate.
Yeah. And there's still enough discharge to maintain. But gradually, if it goes on long enough, you're going to wind up with a huge swamp that becomes less and less life-supporting, and eventually you're going to get gigantic areas of death, basically dead marshes, really, where there is no, that can't sustain life. And you drive sometimes and you see them, where you'll see just lush areas, and then all of a sudden, like areas where you see nothing is alive or growing. And the most distinctive thing about those areas usually is that you don't see, there'll be birds and trees all around a particular area, and around those spots, nothing. There are no birds, no animals go there, essentially because, mystically we say they don't go there because they know it's something bad. They don't go there because there's no life.
Right.
There's nothing.
But when things become peak, certain things become bombs and all that stuff, there's a way of this whole thing recycling where it's still in a very maybe low life sense.
That was what Reich had hoped, and certainly in the early experiments and the hopes for things like what he called the doorbuster and various techniques, was that the idea was that, as with a swamp, if you get in there and unclog it and begin to stir it up, it can be revitalized. However, as he discovered with cancer, which was the biggest problem if you read the cancer biography, when you begin, it's not so much getting it cleared up and getting it stirred up, is that when you do this, it produces a lot of,
what happens to the waste?
The waste. How are you going to get rid of the waste?
Right.
And if the waste begins to move and clog up worse, you could wind up really completely accelerating the process of deterioration. just to finish, follow this out. So the issue of death, then, if one follows it this way, is the gradual limitation of the organism, right? The gradual limitation of the organism's capacity to maintain itself on a pulsatory level. Now, the issue, of course, based on everything we've talked about, is why does this happen? How did this happen? Well, that, of course, brings you back to the nature of self-regulation, the nature of the environment you live in, okay? So that if you're a relatively healthy, vibratory, living organism, and you're suddenly in an environment that's profoundly diminished in its capacity to support living function, right? If you're a happy, vibrant individual who's suddenly in a miserable, cramped living situation with no access to private, to intimate contact, to tenderness, to the embrace, to the natural function of the organism, for a variety of reasons, which go beyond anything we're going to necessarily address today, the organism in a variety of ways begins to shut down. Now, it doesn't necessarily immediately go to complete death, although some individuals die very quickly.
Wait, if you're going to ask the question, why does it happen, even in the best circumstances, the healthiest person in the best environment will still die eventually.
Right. Why?
Sometimes they can't take, the healthiest people can't take it. Like I remember when there was this... but it's the same thing, like the airplane crash, and some people ate other people, and some other people couldn't. And I said they died, now they could have been the healthiest people. You know what I mean? You often see that the healthiest people could die quickly because they have something that's so healthy.
Very often, armored organisms can tolerate greater misery and greater pain and greater suffering and greater limitation. Very often, very lively organisms, right, cannot tolerate, the sudden limitation. But this is all
circumstantial. The point I was trying to make is simply that there is a natural winding down of the ability to pulsate, even in the best circumstances. Right. But the armored organism is going to go through that process sort of in different arcs, in terms of their ability.
They can take it.
literally different parts of the body die at different rates.
Right. And Well, demographic here's a fascinating thing which I always like to point out, and this I think pertains to this. Demographically, from an ethnographic point of view, from a study of environmental life of organisms, human organism in nature, from everything we know, both in terms of the study of small hunting and gathering groups to the also paleontological evidence, right? The archaeological evidence. The average lifespan of the organism, the ideal lifespan, is roughly 40 years, something around that. Yeah. And that males, it would appear somewhat longer, but females pretty much after menopause, after the end of the reproductive cycle, basically, go. So we now live in a world, and I remember Dr. Sobey, Reich doesn't really talk, I haven't found anything where he specifically talks about it, but Dr. Sobey and I talked about this, was that we live in a world that has allowed life to extend beyond that natural process, right? And certainly the lore of that is that we all want to live longer, But the problem is we live in this situation where if the natural organism is depleted and begins to, so the assumption, I think that's what I'm trying to address. The assumption is that if you're ergonomically healthy, you're going to live longer. That gives you, I think some people, not all people, but many individuals have the idea that if you lead an ergonomically healthy life, that's the answer to long life. That in fact, it might well be that a relatively healthy vibratory organism has a much shorter lifespan, but lives fuller, lives more, functionally, engaged, and in a sense begins to, once it's gone through its natural process. Don't forget, in nature, we say that the female organism after around 40, around menopause, roughly, pretty much dies in nature. She's usually had something like 21 to 25 pregnancies, not births, but because she's continuously either raising children or pregnant. Okay, so that at age 40, it seems reasonable that the organism would be pretty much depleted. and males pretty close to that, maybe a little bit statistically a little bit higher, but roughly in the 40s. So the assumption that living on to 70, 80, 90, 100 is a sign of health might well be a sign that, well, you can keep the organism, it's again like the swamp. It's functioning, it's moving along, but this part doesn't work so well, and this part is not so great, and this part is, less
They're living on drugs.
That's interesting if you extend that idea and think about more and more people living on, but in as a kind of dead organism, and that starts to color
social
infants,
right?
So
that's right.
The whole culture becomes.
That's right.
And that's why zombie movies are always so popular.
Well, that's why probably the single most wonderful example, insight into this, and again, nothing is new under the sun, is if one reads Jonathan Swift, and there's a section in Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels is not just a popular story of going to Lilliput and the big people, little people, but there are these other wonderful sections in the book of various kinds of encounters as he moves through the world, in a sense. And there's this one little section in which he's traveling on a ship, he's being transported, and off in the distance they see this other big ship, sort of almost like a ship the size of another world. One thinks of Star Trek and those things. That's not new either. These stories are all there. So he asked, "What's that ship over there?" Because the ship that he's on is trying to avoid this big ship. And he said, "What's that ship over there?" And he said, "Oh, that's the such and such people. I forget who they were." And he said, "They live forever." So he said, "Oh, that's spectacular. I want to meet them." He said, "No, you don't want to meet them." He said, "I know. They live forever. I want to meet them. They've been here since the world was created. You don't want to meet them." So finally he prevails on them, and they take them to meet them. And they come to this world that is totally decayed, totally insane, totally beyond any. It's like a nightmare. And the deal is they live forever, but they get old forever. They decay forever.
Keep getting old.
And so there's nothing rational within there. I mean, it's all just dysfunction. Okay. So I think that's the point. And clearly, there's a lot of interesting tie-in with this. The wonderful experiments that were done. Well, I mean, wonderful in the sense of awesomely wonderful experiments, along with the idea of zombie movies that were done originally in Arizona in the 1930s, but then repeated at Yale in the 60s. I think maybe since then in the 80s too. You could do it yourself if you want to go to the trouble. You get two large cage areas, right, with a nice mouse colony, right, and you have one world A and one world B. Mice, by the way, you know what? You always study mice because mice are actually, in fact, closer to humans than almost any other species. Right?
Now speak for yourself.
I like mice.
I had a dead mouse here the other day. I wish I would have been perfect.
But anyway, mice tend to marry, to establish mated relationships for life. And they take care of their families in very, very nurturing ways.
And you say this is like humans?
Well, close. Okay. And they tend to have social organizations of individual groups that socially cooperate and share, and it's very communal. And so anyway, you create this mouse world with a perfectly adequate resources for maintaining the social life of the group, and then you create another world the same way. One world A you keep regulated, so as the population grows, you take groups out, and you keep it always in balance. The other world you let go freely, and as mice will, like humans, they will overpopulate, and it will just continue to go. And what happens? You study what happens in the world where you keep the population, even and balanced. Things go on completely normally and functionally, and the mouse colonies remain completely healthy. In the world that you let it proliferate, gradually there appears to be, they can even calculate statistically, a mass that's reached, a critical mass, where the population becomes so overcrowded, that you begin to get breakdown. What do you begin to see in the breakdown of mice, of mouse kingdom B, or world B, is increased violence towards each other, stealing, which is atypical of mice. I mean, stealing food caches, hoarding, raids, bands develop that attack other bands, warfare begins to emerge. It's fascinating stuff. Cannibalism, physical abuse between mice mates, abuse of children, eating of children, and then in the final stages, the development of what could only be described as catatonia. You begin to see mice that become totally catatonic, can't relate, begin to show, ritualized, highly structural movements, rocking, inability to focus, inability to move, and then gradually die off. And that what's scary about these studies is that it appears that once this critical mass is reached, even severely reducing the population back to its normal process don't seem to, within a number of generations, create any significant change in the dysfunction. In other words, the disease, in terms of what Scott saying, has become deeply, transmitted into the whole organism of the society. Whether and the studies have never been done, to my knowledge, long enough to know whether, after 5, 6, 7 generations of correcting, you could get it back. But clearly, initially, there seems to be a critical mass. So if you view it that way, it well might be that, in fact, these processes of dying are not simply what happens in the living in the individual organism, but they are persistently consistent through the whole fabric of nature. Okay?
But am I right in thinking that Dr. Reich would have a very hopeful attitude? Mm-hmm. Because look at all of his work, that he saw all of these terrible things, and he always had the children of the future in mind, and this and that. So I always have a very hopeful attitude because of Reich.
Yeah, well, I think so do I, and I think Reich
with
remains...
all those mazes and this and that.
No, I think Reich, based on my understanding of him, and we each all have our understanding, remains incredibly optimistic. I think the problem is that, as I've always understood it, and this is not Reich, this is me, is that Reich and a number of people of his generation particularly were possibly more optimistic. And even at the end, Reich says in a number of letters and articles that he didn't realize quite, in the letters to Neil, he talks about how they didn't realize just how, deep the problems were. That there's that wonderful exchange between him and Neil, where the feeling, Neil asked Reich about the Second World War. Reich doesn't, he talks about the Second World War, but it's not like he doesn't like write a major study of the Second World War. I mean, it's there, but it's not like you'd think that, like everyone else, everyone would be talking about this, and his view of the Second World War was that, and this was not inconsistent with many intellectuals and artists and serious thinkers, that while it was horrible, that this was a great optimistic opportunity. That this, in Reich's terms, this was the breakdown of the old order. And that there was this like clearing up the swamp, that out of this would emerge more rational, healthy organisms that could realize only how horrible, this was, and rebuild a healthier and better world. And in fact, that well might be the case. But I think in the initial reading of Reich's initial response was that this was going to happen faster, and it was going to be easier. And in the last kinds of writings about this and ruminations about this, discussions about this in Reich's work, is he realizes that he says it might in fact, the error was that it might take literally hundreds and thousands of years before this process can be reversed. And in that respect, he remains optimistic. But as Dr. Sophie, I'll guess some of it, and at least my comments, in that context is that of course you got your choice, since none of us are going to be here to see it, although probably each of us keeps sitting around thinking that, well, I'll figure out a way to do it, I'll get by, but since we're not going to be around, you can choose to believe that there is hope for the future, or that there isn't. So depending on your character structure, bringing it back to character analysis, you'll see it as, a process that's moving more positively towards the future, even though right along the way it can be pretty discouraging, or that it's inevitably doomed. So personally, I choose to believe it's a progressive and optimistic future, even though it can look pretty dismal at any given time, in the world.
Well, nature ultimately will always renew itself somehow according to its own laws.
Right.
Even if it means, that our entire civilization, planet, universe, whatever, dies out.
Take over,
Right.
But are we living...
Not the mice, it would be cockroaches probably.
Cockroaches.
We know that cockroaches... We know that the cockroach is the oldest living, continuous living organism in nature. There are varieties of cockroaches found well over 3-4 million years old that are essentially in structure essentially the same as contemporary cockroaches. So cockroaches can also live on inorganic matter, which is interesting.
It ain't broke.
Do we know anything about the cockroach lifestyle or way
about the lifestyle?
Yeah,
well, they don't take care of their children, although they do protect their eggs, and they're very efficient. And the most, since I've always found them I have read about them. The fascinating thing is, contrary to what everyone thinks, is they're not particularly dirty. They don't really spread. Flies are the real culprits. Flies are possibly the single largest organism that spreads disease.
They're an allergen, however.
What? Cockroach, you can have allergies to them, but the reality, let me tell you, the final reality is we're allergic to everything. There's nothing in nature that can't produce allergies. The question, again, is the organism's ability to adjust and now one of the along with that, what is interesting is as the organism gets less vibrant and modal, it begins to develop increased sensitivity to allergens. So that in humans who are, it's not in praising myself, I never had any serious allergies until about, I'm 60 now, so until about 5 or 6 years ago, I started developing, mild allergies. And obviously, the literature says that as you get older, allergies become more persistent. The immune system. And my guess is that different individuals are much more, are more capable of, having more. You have a more vibrant immune system, not a better immune system, just more vital. Fights it off, and that some, and that one of the things that Reich, I think, makes very available is. Our assumption is that when you see a young child, right, they will have that they're more alive. But that in fact, the problem with this is that you can be a young child and be vitally compromised in terms of the motility and vibrancy of the organism, which is why it becomes in Reich's work vital to begin to try to increase the prophylaxis or the support of young children in terms of being able to live and remain relatively modal and vital. But I think, these are processes. The issue of limitation, ideally we're looking at a curve that says like from here to 40 or so, is a period of great vibrance and life, and then gradually goes down. But it can, in some organisms, can be only a matter of a year or so. Some organisms, what's interesting is the fascinating phenomena, although horrible, of young babies that are born already severely immunologically and cellularly compromised, so that you get children who die of cancer by the time they're 18 months old or so. So these are processes that aren't specific to a lifespan as much as the vitality Dr. Sobel used to say, some organisms, particularly young, very, very open organisms, are so, if the abuse in the environment is so brutal, the organism simply gives up, can't fight anymore.
There's an interesting thing. They were interviewing the Dalai Lama, and of course the reporter was in awe of the Dalai Lama, felt he had some great secret to life, and he was talking about meditation as being, a way, and he was giving the example in praising meditation of a monk who was skilled in meditation and had reached these degrees of whatever, and they did tests where they would fire off a gun unexpectedly in the vicinity of these people, and it didn't disturb them at all. To me, that's a demonstration of deadness. I mean, an organism that is alive would jump out of their seat and say, well, what's going on here? But they didn't, and they thought that it was great. So it's...
Well, that raises the question, because I remember asking Dr. Sobey, well, what about, so if being alive is so, this is where I began to get clear about the fact that being alive doesn't mean that you live longer, being more vibrant and alive. So what about these monks or nuns or whatever, who live to be 100 in the monastery, having no love life, although now we find out that isn't necessarily true, but nonetheless, I mean, being relatively restricted in one's life, in very much the way you're talking about. And I remember Dr. Sobey saying, yeah, because what happens is the organism it lives, but it's the quality of life. Now, fascinating along with that in terms of recent discoveries, if you want to live to be well into your hundreds, right, the way to do it is how?
No.
Starve yourself.
Starve yourself.
That's a misnomer. I found out that that's not quite accurate, because in the studies that they did, they were they lowered the
caloric
intake,
right,
but they loaded the diet with nutrients. It was heavily loaded with all kinds of nutrients, less calories.
Right.
What happens is that the insulin production changes, and it's the problem with insulin really that is it causes a lot of disease.
Yeah. The issue is you can prolong the actual lifespan, but when you look at the quality, again, it's the swift analog of the ship that lives forever, the world lives forever. But the point is that again, it involves such a severe reduction, so that what happens is the motility becomes so limited and so minimal that you prolong it, but essentially it's not. It's the zombie. It's
the pleasure principle goes, isn't that though? Like
that's right. So right. So I'll end then with the great Red Fox joke. Everyone knows Red Fox. Those of you who don't know, Red Fox was a great black comedian, sort of before Richard Pryor or Eddie Murphy, and Red Fox's joke was, well, first you give up smoking, then you give up drinking, then you give up sex, then you give up eating all the good foods, and then one day you're in the hospital dying of nothing. So, in a sense, that, again, the issue then becomes that life functions and death, in a sense, I guess, as I'm trying to understand it, or at least look at it from this, is a natural, I guess that's part of what I'm getting at, is that it's a natural process. It's part of a natural process. And actually, even I think we tend to organize it as a distinct moment versus, the rest of the living process, but it's part of the living process. And what it is really something that basically expresses itself through the living process, and what goes on afterwards is hard to say. I mean, and that leads us to issues of wondering about, does it continue? What happens to the energy? What happens to the cellular structure? Does it return?
Well, doesn't Reich talk about how basically, everything,
right,
you go in the woods,
right,
everything is alive.
Right.
Literally everything around you is alive.
Right.
And everything dies.
Right.
So therefore, everything has been alive.
Right.
And I think Reich always mentions that the energy passes into the energy of the larger stream of energy.
That there is, in Reich's final understanding, is that there is the ocean of energy. It's a cosmic energy, and that all energy, basically, I think part of the other understanding is what is life, which is essentially is how at certain moments a membrane organizes around this energy and it becomes modal and functions. And once that once that overall structure is no longer there, the energy is released back into this ocean.
So we have another chance?
The question is there a consciousness?
No, right. And what Norman is raising, I think, for all of us is the great lore of this whole thing, the great fascination with this, is not really the nature of life and death as a natural function. It's the issue of, and it's the real disturbing issue is consciousness, and that's the real kicker. It's what Reich talks about in the murder of Christ is that what the tree of life, the image in the Garden of Eden of Eve and Adam eating. They say the apple. It's not the apple. It's the fruit of knowledge, and it's the tree of life. And what it is the sudden realization. And basically, what it is a poetic creation of the point of when you become conscious.
And they become conscious that they were naked.
Right. No, naked, but also alive. Right. And that's the central image. The nakedness and the sexuality is the sense of
the
like
self-consciousness, the thing that separates them from the animals who would never think about being naked.
So the interesting thing is that according to this artistic creation, to live in what paradise is to live free of any awareness of the process and just live in the process. What happens is once you eat of the tree of knowledge, is you look at yourself, you realize you're naked. Sex becomes more enjoyable on some conscious level, but then you got all the mission, and then you're cast out. And Reich points this it's just one of the great moments, I think, in Reich's writing. It's as great as any poem that I've ever read by Shakespeare or anyone. It's just a brilliant handling of that. When you're cast out of the garden, you spend the rest of your life trying to figure out how to get back in. And then he says, in true, again, one wants to find out Reich's connections to things like Zen, like Zen tradition, the entrance back in is exactly the same exit out. Right? So what happens is if you do get to it, in the Bible, you're told that what God has done at that point, right, has posted angels with fiery swords to block the entrance, right, back in. And that to get back in, you have to go through this horrible, fiery, horrendous process. And that, as Reich says, and very touchingly, poignantly, is that most people, if they ever find the entrance back in and try to get back through, after a while just say, it's simply not possible, it's not worth it. And in other traditions, Eastern traditions, it's fascinating. It's a consistent image of that, not necessarily the Garden of Eden or paradise, but even in the Buddhist tradition of births and rebirths, and it's the process of going through various experiences of suffering. And interesting in the Buddhist tradition is what happens is someone said, do you get a second chance? In the Buddhist tradition is, you get many chances. It all is dissipated into the ocean of energy and it gets reformed. But in true Buddhist tradition, it's suffer. Each time you come back, you suffer because the energy isn't really free. It's organized into another life form, whether it's a cockroach or a human organism. It's you have to go through this horrible process of trying to get it right. And in Buddhist tradition, right, getting it right means you achieve extinction, which is what? In which the energy is completely liberated and free, and you don't longer have to get back. But what you lack at that point is consciousness.
The consciousness of to enjoy it.
But when I think I read Cosmic Superimposition, that whole thing about, I think Reich talked about the man way back, that consciousness is what was the beginning of the armor, because he turns against some.
That's right.
So what's that got to do with the Garden of Eden?
Well, because in reality, what Reich says is that it's not that there was a Garden of Eden, is that the reason the myth appeals to us is that in some place in our deep, deep history as a species, we made deals to accept certain limitations on our organism, which we could call armoring, in trade-off for certain protections or other securities. And as a result, in the process, at first it didn't feel that bad. It's like the swamp again. At first it didn't feel that bad. It wasn't that big a compromise. And gradually, suddenly you couldn't get back to where you were.
We find ourselves in world B.
But so he's saying you don't ever get back.
Right, that's right.
That beginning.
Right. But you still long for it.
So what's optimistic about that?
I don't know.
It's very optimistic because you know where you stand.
I an optimistic light on that.
Okay.
In some traditions, some Eastern traditions are what are considered non-dual, like Zen, and they would claim
Non-what?
Non-dual. They would claim that the way that we've been talking about transformation is dualistic, that there's still something to strive for, and that's exactly part of the problem.
Right.
So in fact, in Zen, you strive for direct, immediate realization, in which you realize that everything in life is the same as non-life. Everything in your limitation is the same as your absolute expansion. And so you don't have to actually leave the world. You don't have to meditate, because to actually do anything is part of the problem. So they try to get at it through...
Right, that's very interesting, because the idea is that...
You don't have to have hope.
Right.
And isn't that what Jesus said too?
Right. The interesting thing about Buddha, if one follows the true story of Buddha, I mean the story of Buddha as it's been delivered, is fascinating, is that Buddha achieves extinction, or nirvana, and he comes back. And in the true tradition, everyone tries to figure out, why does Buddha come back? And the answer is, there is no answer. He doesn't come back because he loves humanity. He doesn't come back because he cares. He doesn't come back because he's giving a message to help people, find the truth. It's like in a sense, beyond anything that we could understand. It simply happens. Right. That's right. Right.
I'm the one who always said sex has no meaning.
Right.
It is.
Well, he also said that life had life has no meaning except the fact that
it is. Right. So when someone says to me, I've had this experience with people who come looking for a spiritual message from Orgonomic or whatever, they said, "What, don't you believe life has a meaning?" I said, "Yeah, the meaning of life is life. It is, and it is what it is." And they said, "But how can you live with that?" I said, it's not a matter of how I can live with it. It simply is what it is. And so they said, "Well, you're not spiritual," and that might well be the case.
Well, God, when people believe in God, it doesn't make it easier.
It can. No, right.
Look, he did it. Then you know.
That's exactly right. That there is a fallacy, and Selby was always Dr. Selby was always very sensitive to this. It is not correct to assume that people who have faith or try to build systems are doing something profoundly wrong or profoundly that it is a natural function of trying to make meaning and find some function, and that in many cases it can make the process of going through life easier. I mean, I can remember years ago when Dr. Selby was on, we talked about this. There was this happens all the time, but it was a particularly, very, very sad circumstance where there was a bus under a tree during a freak lightning storm out in Brooklyn, and these little girls who were in the school bus were killed, 2 little sisters, right? And I remember seeing the father interviewed it was part of a Baptist school, fundamentalist school, and the father was saying, he was heartbroken and it was a great loss, but this was God's will, and God had a reason for taking them, and they were happy now. And I remember talking with Dr. Sobel, and we both agreed that for this man, this absolutely unimaginable, horrible circumstance became something he could, weather and live in. So what were you going to say to him? Don't believe in that. That's just a bunch of lies. It's just a bunch of crap that's designed to keep you in prison. The fact is, you do the best you can.
But that's one of the reasons why it's good to be God. Because if you're God, if you do something bad, you're not blamed, and if you do something good, everybody thanks you. It doesn't matter what you do.
That's right.
Everybody says, "Praise be to God."
I think we'll end on that quote from Mel Brooks. Basically, he has a joke about it's good to be king. King is good.
But Borges has a short story in which Shakespeare is dying. He's on his deathbed, and he asks God, he says, "Who am I? What am I doing here? What's this about?" And God says to him, "You are someone who has created a lot of characters out of your imagination, just as I have created you out of my imagination, and just as someone has created me out of their imagination."
That's why. Okay.
I like that one.
Ending with stories like this, and I think there's something about all of these stories, and it would be fascinating to actually do a big anthology, because there are all these stories to explain, which have this kind of thing. I'll do two. One is a joke, which is some of you may have heard. I'll end on that one. But first is this sense that we're always looking for a variety of explanations of what again the meaning is, and most of it's about how to come to terms with what we're all facing and to come to ease. And so the assumption that our explanation is better than the other, it's all about how you get through. But the final joke, which was also Dr. Sobey liked, was the old hippie joke where this guy has spent his entire life, I won't do the long version, I'll cut it short, spent his entire life looking for the answer. And he spent his entire fortune, and no one has given him the real answer. Right? So finally he hears from some, remote, he's in a village up in Nepal, and he hears from this guy that up on the highest peak of Everest there's a little spot where a true guru lives who has the truth. And so he sets out to find this guy, and he climbs, and he's literally at death's door when he reaches this little plateau, and he comes up, and there's this beautiful, it's like spring, and it's just Shangri-La, it's paradise, and sitting in the middle of this is this really beatific old man who's just smiling and totally vibrant, and light is streaming from him. And he says, "Oh, I found you. Can you tell me what the truth is?" And the old man says, "The truth, my son, is a strawberry ice cream cone." And the guy goes ballistic. "What? My whole life, everything I've given up everything, and you're telling me the truth is a strawberry ice cream cone?" The old guy says, "It's not." Okay. Well, thank you all, and again, I'll let you know when we pick up with a new life formation. Thanks, David. And anyone who owes, not to get crass, but anyone who owes me any money, take care of them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So you don't have any questions and answers on this?
Of course, that was the famous the famous Alice B. Toklas account of Gertrude Stein when they leaned over and she said, Gertrude, what's the answer?" And Gertrude looked up and said, "Alice, what's the question?"
I also should quote Woody Allen because he had a good ending. So what if we only go around once? What if this is it? Well, then I guess we should just enjoy it as much as we can, because this may be the only time we're there. And that's really the answer. Just enjoy the good times when you can. Thomas first.
That's always good.
You're no longer a student. You graduated. Yes. Push your phone out. Okay.
I had good news and bad news.
What's the good news?
I know.
I found